I love this reading. Every week it just varies what's going to come and what do we get to talk about today. But as you may remember, those of you who come every week, Swamiji has arranged these readings so that week after week for several weeks now, we've been facing this dilemma of the Jewish people and how they were dealing with law. But here he really finally turns that corner. And so the obvious message in the reading is just so clear. And he even says it. He says, it doesn't matter how many laws you're obeying. It doesn't matter about the intellectual hair splitting, he calls it, because they're really trying to get it right down to the law. I mean, at some other point in the Bible, they ask him, is it okay to do any healing on the Sabbath? And he says to them, in essence, are you serious? I mean, if one of your sheep fell over the side of the hill, wouldn't you go and get him and save him? Why are you asking me if you would heal a human being on the Sabbath? Of course you would. Whatever is the higher goal, the higher purpose, the higher good, that's what we do. And here he says to them, why are you so concerned with such details of your law that you're worried about whether somebody is washing their hands properly? You who have, he doesn't say this in this reading, but elsewhere, you who have strayed so far from the heart. He comes in this reading to say, love reigns supreme. Love trumps and transcends everything. And there are just so many stories that come to mind about it. There's a wonderful story of St. Francis, who was in the process of creating the Franciscan order. And he had a few monks with him, but he went away at one time to travel. And one of the newer brothers was at home. And when Francis got back, the brother was so happy to tell Francis, those 3 thieves who have been terrorizing the town, they actually had the nerve to run in here and seek refuge when they really made the townspeople mad. And the brother says to Francis, but I let them know that they could not come into our church and seek refuge after all of the crimes that they've committed. And they, of course, expected Francis to just be so thrilled with them. But Francis, who had just come in and he had been begging for his supper, which he always did, so he had a bowl of scraps with him, he said, you must go and find those 3 men immediately. And he hands them his food. And he says, you take this food to them, and first you touch their feet, and then you offer them this food, and then you bring them back to me. And of course, the brother is totally confused, but he does as Francis tells him to do, and he goes out and he finds these 3 men, and they're as surprised as he is, but he touches their feet and brings them back. And Francis says to them, why do you behave this way? There's so much more to you, and you could have so much more if you acted through love, if you treated people well. And in that moment, it's described that they just transformed. They wound up joining the order and living the rest of their lives with Francis. I mean, just in essence, even breaking the laws, but love reigns supreme. Francis was able to touch them with that love. I had a remarkable, I've had hundreds of remarkable experiences in my practice of medicine, and many of you have heard me tell many of these stories, but it's such a perfect example of where one would be inclined to learn every detail of medicine. You remember 2 weeks ago I was saying I spent years doing that and would live in terror every night that I might not learn some detail that I would then need to save somebody's life. It was a little bit of a delusion of grandeur, but that's where you are in your first 2 years of medical school. And I was telling a different story then about how I created a vibration of success with this little ritual that I developed. But that's what's trained into you in medicine. There's a huge fund of knowledge that you have to learn. And this is a story that happened to me with the very first patient that I ever went to see in the hospital. Now, it is true that I had been a nurse for almost 14 years, so I was not new to hospitals and I was not new to being with people, but I was certainly new to being in the role where I was going to be expected to come up with a diagnosis and think of the treatment that was going to help this person. So they asked me to go see this woman on the cardiac ward, an older woman who they told me was dying. And she had I think she was in congestive heart failure, I don't exactly remember. But she was dying, and when I went onto the ward, the nurses said to me, she is just so sick of seeing people, and she's got no will to live. And I was just sick, because what was I going to do, walk in and tell her that I was going to be the one that was going to save her life? That was absurd. So I just sat with it for a minute, and I went in, and I looked at her, and she was so tired. This woman just looked so tired. This was 30-some years ago, but I can just see her so clearly right now. And I looked at her, and I was thinking to myself, what do I have to offer this woman? And she looked at me, and I said to her, how are you? And she just looked at me again, and she stared at me. There was a real pregnant pause. And then she started talking. And she talked to me for the full hour that I had, that I was to be there, ultimately with enough information to write what was supposed to be a 6 or 8 page history and physical. And it was a huge risk that I took, really, because my first patient at Stanford, nobody else was going to be thrilled with this. But that woman talked for 1 hour. She told me how tired she was, how sad she was, how many of her friends had died, how hard it was to be in her body. And I never said a word. I sat, I looked at her, I sent her great compassion with my eyes, with my body language. I put my hand on her leg. And when we were all done, I said to her, thank you so much for telling me your story. It's just meant so much to me. And we hugged each other goodbye. This is an absolutely true story. 2 days later, it was time for me to go back and do my follow-up. But I get to the room, and the bed's empty and stripped. Now, of course, I thought she died. But I went to the nurses, and they said, a miracle happened. That's what they said to me. So they said the next day, she got up out of bed, and she said, I feel so much better. I want to go home. And without another question, they sent her home. What was the miracle from this first-year medical student who knew very little, not nothing, because I'd been a coronary care unit nurse, but very little, and I didn't say a word, not a word. It is such an example of how little knowledge meant. For weeks, all of Stanford University had been trying to save this woman's life. And in 1 hour, I walked in and I cared about that woman. It is so remarkable how much happens when we can remember to transcend the laws, transcend the knowledge. Jesus says in this reading, it's not what comes into a man's mouth. And we can say into his mouth in terms of food. And I was thinking just this morning as I was driving here, you remember this story from Autobiography of a Yogi, where Master eats that putrid food off of a steaming hot sidewalk in some city in India. I don't remember where he was. It's not what goes into a man's mouth. But remember, when we're using the word mouth, we're talking about the mouth of God too, how everything comes to us, all of our knowledge. We're saying, it doesn't matter how much knowledge we have. It doesn't matter how closely we follow the law. In the end, love reigns supreme. It can heal anything. That's the obvious part of this reading today. That's what Jesus was saying to the Pharisees. Well, I remembered as I read this reading a few days ago about a book that I read many years ago called My Grandfather's Blessings. And it's a beautiful book written by, interestingly, an MD, a medical doctor. I will tell you, many times in my life, people have said to me, either if my practice is full or I'm leaving practice, or, do you know anybody who practices like you? And honestly, I haven't known a lot of physicians who have practiced like me, who have been so willing to consider people, body, mind, and soul. In fact, who have insisted on considering people in that way. But Rachel Remens, not only does she do that beautifully, but add on top of that, she is a brilliant writer. So she's written 2 fabulous books, and one of them was called My Grandfather's Blessings. And in the beginning of that book, she introduces us to her grandfather, who was an Orthodox rabbi. But he was a Kabbalist. He was a rabbi from mystical Judaism. He studied mystical Judaism. So he studied the Kabbalah, which I've always known, though I've never studied it, is very much like our teachings, because really they're teaching Sanatana Dharma. I mean, you can call it what you want, but at the essence of every great religion, of course, are these same teachings. And I've known that that's what mystical Judaism is, though I was never exposed to it. And this man loved her with such purity of heart and such wisdom. And he was her primary teacher for the first 7 years of her life until he died. I'm just going to say something very interesting. Later in the book, and I have not read this story in probably 10 years, so if there's any Rachel Remen experts here, forgive me if I get it a little wrong, but she tells a story about that her mother tells her later, long after her grandfather has died. And the story is that her mother and her father, Rachel's grandfather, were living in Russia. And he was clearly a very wise man. He had a dream that all of the Jews, I forget exactly what happened in his dream, but all of the synagogues were destroyed. And he knew every one of them, and he watched each one being destroyed. 2 weeks later, he had the same dream. He packed up his whole family and left Russia. And within weeks, the pogrom started. So this was a very wise man. But he was an Orthodox Jew. And part of the teaching was that you don't bow before any other idol. And in that teaching for the Jews, in all of these 600 or 800 laws, was included dolls. Your children were not allowed to have dolls, like that was an idol. So these little girls who had very little, Rachel's mother and her sister, in school one day were given a china doll, and they had very little, and they loved this doll. Her mother said it had big blue eyes and blonde hair, and they brought it home, and her father, Rachel's grandfather now, was so enraged that anybody would do that or that his daughters would have a doll because the law said no dolls, that he took the doll and he smashed it against the wall. And Rachel's mother, Rachel said, as her mother told her this story 50, 60 years later, it just brought tears to her eyes. She loved that doll so much. So this man that I'm about to describe here, right here in this story, is the man who was living by the law in one moment, breaking his daughters' hearts, but now comes and says to Rachel, in essence, through the first 7 years of her life, everybody has the power to bless other people. Every one of us have the ability to bless. And he teaches her about blessings. And he says to her, the teachings of the Kabbalah, that the holy, which is how they refer to it, the holy, at some point in time, broke up into billions of little sparks. And those sparks manifested in the world as everything. Everyone and everything has a spark of the divine in it. You see, just like we teach, God is in everything. And so, every time we run into one of those sparks, which is, of course, constantly, there is an opportunity to either bless that aspect of the divine or to be blessed by it. And he taught her, again, over years, the truth about God appearing in our lives, the truth about the opportunity to love. Because what does it mean to most of us when we say divine love is supreme? What does it really mean when we say, see God in everything and everyone? God is everywhere. How do we translate that into what we will do day by day by day to both live in terms of good karma, which means manifesting love, which will attract love back, loving other people, really seeing what is whole and rich and perfect in people. We have to find some way, some teaching to do that. And it turns out that the Kabbalah has this perfect language for it, because it says it'll come to you in the most mundane moments, areas of your life, in moments when you're not expecting it. It'll speak to you. Sometimes you'll hear it in your ears, sometimes you'll feel it in your heart. But that is God speaking to you. And when you notice that and you bless consciously, you bless that spark of the divine, you are creating, you're not giving somebody something, you're entering an experience, you're creating a moment, you're creating an energy in which you can be in love. There's nothing else for us to do in the world. So, of course, the Jews, but not just the Jews, Thich Nhat Hanh does this also. He's got a book of prayers. What's the prayer you say when you turn on the water? What's the prayer when you turn it off? That's the Buddhist teaching, when you open a door, when you turn on a light. But the Jews did it too. They have a prayer or a blessing, which is such a beautiful word that the Kabbalists call it, for everything, so that we can remember, I'm opening the door. This is an aspect of the divine. I'm bumping into one of my friends. Here's God incarnate. Everything we do, that we enter into that moment and realize that it's a holy moment. And what I've found through my practice of medicine, and many of you will remember that this whole practice is blessed by these masters. I could never have known this on my own, is that what everybody is looking for in the world is to be loved. And how can we help them feel love and know it? We can do that by seeing them, by letting people know we're right here for you. We're listening to you. We see you. And more than that, you are perfect just as you are. Nobody can ever tell you otherwise, because look, I'm sitting here with you right now, and we are affirming we are together in God. We don't use those words. But in that moment, when we are in that love, we know God in a way that we never can with our minds. We can search and question and ask and argue as long as we want. We'll never feel it. We won't feel it until we do what David read in our affirmation today. lay our heart's devotion at the feet of the omnipresent. And now we know we can find that omnipresent everywhere, in everyone. We have a natural inclination in us. We are born to raise our energy up. Jesus said in this reading, you will never transcend ego consciousness by intellectual hair splitting. He didn't use those words, but that's what he's saying. You're not going to get anywhere. Put that down. Open your heart. Open your heart to me, and I will enter and take charge of your life. And what does he mean? I will show you love. We can't get there any other way. But our whole life is inclined to go towards that love. Everything in us wants to raise ourselves up through this astral spine, right through the mouth of God. We don't stop where everything comes in. We take everything that comes in and we bring it up here to the point between the eyebrows, which is, after all, the quintessential blessing. That's really what we're doing. We're finding every way we can. And when we begin this practice to honor it in everyone, not only do we see the miracle of them changing, and it is a miracle. That's how this woman was able to get up and go home. That's how those 3 men that came to St. Francis were able to suddenly move from being thieves and robbers and tormenting and harassing people to becoming brothers in the Franciscan order. There is no power in this world. There is no thinking, learning, being power in this world that will ever get us there. And there is no way that God's love won't get us there. That is the power of the divine. And what Rachel's grandfather taught her in all the little ways that you would teach a little girl, but that are as relevant to every one of us, is it takes faith, it takes hope. When you bless somebody, I thought about it because at the end of all of my emails now, for years and years, I sign them, Blessings, Shanti. And years ago, I would have said to myself, what right do I have to bless anybody? But you see, this is our path. We not only have the right, but we have to remember now, from this moment on, to just stop. And a blessing can be in so many ways. That's why when I told that story of the woman in the hospital, and it came to me just that way last night, I remembered I didn't say a word to her, but I looked at her with such compassion, and I never took my eyes off of her. And she knew I was there, and I was blessing her. And in a certain moment, I put my hand on her leg as she was lying in bed. I was blessing her. We can smile at somebody. That becomes a blessing. We don't have to say, I'm blessing you, I'm blessing you. Let me just put my fingers here at the point between the eyebrow. Of course not. Every one of our movements, if we get conscious of it, if we ask for help to remember, that's what the blessings are about. Help me remember in every way that I can to bring your love to everyone. There's a beautiful reading from Corinthians that's very well known, so I'm sure you've all heard it, but I want to read part of it to you. It says, if I speak in tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy, and I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor, and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. St. John of the Cross said, if we could substitute one act of love for every good deed that every priest and nun was doing in his time, he said it would be far better for the church. Jesus came to tell the Jewish people, love supreme is really what will change us. Love can change anything. It can transform our lives. He came to tell the people that, and he came to show us how we can do that in our lives. And I realized in this very simple way that the Kabbalists have of telling us God is everywhere. Every time we give a blessing, it helps somebody remember. We call that smriti. But it doesn't matter what the language is or how we're saying it. We all have the ability and the capacity to bless people such that their hearts open and we help them remember, and we help ourselves remember in the process who we are.